Good morning, everybody. So today I'm declaring that the power of the presidency has grown to dangerous proportions, particularly regarding national security and foreign affairs. Those of you who agree with me will think this is obvious. Those who don't agree with me will dismiss this. I want to try to convince you, if you don't agree with me, that this is a problem so that we can all demand more accountability from the White House, now and in the future. Now, in confronting what I consider a perilous growth of executive power, I'm in a difficult position because I'm criticizing, in part, one of the most powerful people on the planet and somebody for whom I have a great deal of respect, President Obama. But I believe this is precisely why I have to speak up, because I believe that respect demands honesty. Most importantly, I think representative democracy demands that we hold our elected officials accountable. Now, I know that we live in a dangerous world. I know there are people out there trying to harm us right now, and sometimes I support the use of force to stop that harm. But our secret and permanent war on terror, egged on by fear and endless technological innovation, is out of control. Just looking at the rise of the drones, for example. We're just beginning development of military applications of unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, otherwise known as drones. The MQ-1 invented in the mid-90s is nicknamed the Predator. Its younger cousin, the MQ-9, is called the Reaper. And these drones are racing across the skies, guided with a remarkable accuracy from around the globe. And we're manufacturing and delivering these by the dozens to the president so he can kill. That is tremendous power. So I want to start with some historical reflections on power. Many early Americans saw that executive power was dangerous, corrupting, and particularly seductive to elected leaders who feel that they've somehow been charged by the populace to do whatever they want. Daniel Webster, on the floor of the Senate in 1834, said, "Executive power has been regarded as a lion that must be caged. It's been dreaded uniformly, always dreaded, as the great source of danger." Lord Acton has a famous quote. He said, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." The next line in that quote that isn't always mentioned is, "Great men are almost always bad men." But it did seem true to me as a teenager, because Richard Nixon taught my generation a thing or two about great men. Here's a man who was corrupted by powers in ways both subtle and blatant. Historian Arthur Schlesinger described Nixon as desiring an imperial presidency. And in some ways, I really do think that Nixon would prefer to be a king than the elective of a constitutional republic. But the idea that the president should be like a king goes all the way back to Alexander Hamilton, who really thought that the president should have powers more like those of a European monarch. Nixon, wanting to be a king, of course he's going to come out with a bizarre statement that he said in the wake of the Watergate scandal, where he said, "When the president does it, that means it's not illegal." He thought of himself as above the law. Placed at the top of any pyramid of power, I wonder whether we would get similarly drunk on power. Now, John Kennedy, who struck many people as much more sober-minded regarding power, still, those who knew him understood him as an incredibly controlling personality who quested for authority. He found his 3 terms in the House of Representatives very difficult. This is what he said about them. It was filled with negotiating and compromise and all those necessary things for democracy. He said, "We were just worms in the House. We were just worms in the House. Nobody paid much attention to us nationally." Well, by the time he got to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, he was ready to take charge, especially in times of crisis. On October 16, 1962, in the middle of managing the missile crisis, he spoke to journalists at the State Department, and he used the following verse about a bullfighter. to the reporters. This is the verse he read. Bullfight critics, row on row, crowd the enormous Plaza de Toros. But only one is there who knows, and he's the one who fights the bull. Ole, Mr. President. Luckily, we did not get gored on ICBMs there, but he took a risk, a great risk, and you wonder where he'd fit in the presidency in our history if that risk did not work out well. Now, some argue that concentration of power is necessary and that our leaders simply have to be controlled by character, ethics. John Adams said, because power corrupts, society demands for moral authority and character increase in importance as the position increases. Another president said, with all the power that a president has, the most important thing to bear in mind is this: you must not give power to a man unless above everything else he has character. Character is the most important qualification that the President of the United States can have. Now, can you guess who said that? Nixon. How well did that work? How good of a safeguard is character? Trust me, right? Well, Americans are very ambivalent about power. We love heroes and grand stories of heroic presidents, while at the same time, if they screw up, they're vilified. U.S. News writer Alex Parker explains, there is a kind of cognitive dissonance. We don't really trust the executives, but practical reality is that we have to because we believe that the executive can get things done. And it becomes extremely common to accuse the president, whoever he is, regardless of the party, of being like Hitler or like Stalin or a dictator. And this tends to distort political discussions. I think that's true. If character and ethics isn't sufficient, can the people control presidents? Can citizens? One of the most powerful presidents we've ever had, Teddy Roosevelt, thought that the people could. He said, I think the presidency should be a very powerful office, and I think the president should be a very strong man who uses without hesitation every power the position yields. But because of that fact, I believe that he should be closely watched by the people, held to strict accountability by them. And that seems appropriate for a nation that gives its executive power not from God, not from heredity, not from force, but from the people. And the people have to use that power and demand that the president is transparent and accountable. Given the fact that the courts are way too slow and Congress, now more than ever, is too divided to control the president, it is up to us, especially regarding national security. Now, the president uses the bully pulpit to try to convince the public to trust his leadership. Richard Neustadt wrote that the president has the power to persuade, but he talks about the fact that this power is often ineffective, and it's very frustrating. Truman was very frustrated about it. He says, Truman said, I sit here all day trying to persuade people to do things they ought to have the common sense to do anyway. That's all the power of the president amounts to. It frustrated people more used to power that's like in the military, it's direct line of power. And it was very frustrating to Eisenhower. Truman actually gloated about the person who was going to take over his office. He said, he'll sit there, Truman predicted, and he'll say, do this, do that, and nothing will happen. Poor Ike, it won't be a bit like the Army. He'll find it very frustrating. He did. Occasionally, Eisenhower had explosions of anger over the disunity. Sometimes he simply was so frustrated because presidential historian Robert Donovan talked about the fact that he was trying to lead the Republican Party, but he said, what's the use of trying to lead the Republican Party? One aide to Eisenhower remarked to Donovan in 1958 that when the president's decided something, that ought to be the end of it. And when it bounced back to him undone or done wrong, he tends to react with shocked surprise. So I don't want to pretend that the presidential power is unlimited. It ebbs and flows. Robert Jackson, Supreme Court Justice, pointed out that presidential powers are not fixed, but they fluctuate depending upon the disjunction and conjunction with those in Congress. Jackson says that there is a zone of twilight in which the president and Congress have concurrent authority, or where its distribution is uncertain. He continues, therefore, congressional inertia, indifference, or quiescence may sometimes, at least as a practical matter, enable, if not invite, measures of independent presidential responsibility. In this area, any actual test of power is likely to depend on the imperatives of events and the contemporary imponderables, rather than on abstract theories of law. Abstract theories of law, like the Constitution. I thought the framers wanted a clear line of division of powers. Did they really want this twilight zone to exist where a president could become abusive of his power? An interesting book called Unchecked and Unbalanced, Presidential Power in a Time of Terror, the authors Schwartz and Hook say, making the executive supreme makes the nation no safer, either from its enemies or from its own worst impulses. Indeed, the abiding genius of the founding generation was to reject the idea that unchecked unilateral power is ever properly vested in any one branch of government. Our government was framed to control itself, as James Madison said in the Federalist Papers. He said, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Dividing the powers between the three branches, the founders harnessed human passions and the cause of limited government. Now, certainly the constitutional creators gave the president immense power by creating him as commander-in-chief, head of state, chief law enforcement officer, with all the powers invested in Article 2 of the Constitution. And as Obama presently is trying to do, which is getting around an obstructionist Congress, the president can unilaterally issue proclamations and executive orders. Since 1789, there have been 7,300 such proclamations. One such proclamation, a relatively harmless one, unless you're a turkey, was that in his first term, George Washington proclaimed Thanksgiving as our holiday. Just did it. Boom, and it became it. Now, given his tremendous popularity, Washington probably could have done anything with proclamations. Delegates to the Constitutional Convention actually didn't really circumscribe presidential power as much as they laid out the legislative process. And some writers said they did that because they didn't want to offend the chair of the Constitutional Convention, the presumed first executive officer, General Washington. So there's not as much of an explanation of the limits of presidential power. So when he was so loved, he could marshal troops, march on farmers in western Pennsylvania, and crush the Whiskey Rebellion with thousands of troops because they were being taxed so heavily, they were being taxed into poverty. But the few cries of tyrants were drowned out by public applause for Washington. I want to take a little historical stroll and just point out a couple of things that some powerful presidents did to show how much power they had, beginning with John Adams, who never fared so well in the press as Washington. Well, he began an undeclared war on France. Got into a lot of trouble with the Francophiles and the rising Democratic-Republican Party led by Jefferson. But nevertheless, he did go to war, naval battles. Jefferson, as third-term president, embodied a contradiction over power in the White House. Because here's a Democratic Republican wary of the very power of the office he was taking. The Democratic Republicans came in on a platform of limiting executive power. But when he sat in the seat of power, it was a totally different story. Very difficult for him to be limited. So when the Louisiana Territory dropped in his lap because of the chess game that England and France were having, Jefferson agonized over this decision. He thought it was an unconstitutional overreach of his power to, with a stroke of the pen, increase the size of the United States by 50%. But that's what he did. He bought 828,000 square miles of verdant land and changed the course of American history. That's power. President Jackson was harshly criticized for his monarchical tendencies. He was nicknamed King Andrew in the press, and there were drawings of him with a crown all the time. He drove tens of thousands of Native Americans from their lands as chief executive, and he threatened to enforce tariff policy by invading South Carolina. He reveled in power. Few would deny that Abraham Lincoln probably flexed his presidential muscle more than any other president. But given the fact that a third of his territory was seceding, maybe that's understandable. But even this following list is pretty impressive. He called on 75,000 soldiers from state militias to national cause. He recruited 40,000 volunteers to serve 3-year terms. He blockaded southern ports, suspended the writ of habeas corpus, and arrested 12,000 citizens. He seized controls of railroads and telegraph lines. He declared martial law in my home state of Maryland. And within a couple of years, he, at least on paper, freed millions of slaves. Desperate measures breed desperate times, for sure, and executive power swelled in the Lincoln White House. At the turn of the 20th century, when America strode out onto the world stage, that's when executive power really began to grow regarding foreign affairs. Teddy Roosevelt swung his big stick, and he blockaded Venezuela, seized the Panama Canal Zone, established American imperialism in lands seized from the crumbling Spanish Empire. A few years later, it took massive economic catastrophe, the Depression, for FDR to swing his power into effect in the domestic sphere, but most people accepted FDR's New Deal revolution. Citizens soon followed FDR into World War II, and after World War II, given the paranoia about communism, President Truman had the power to enter Korea by not calling it a war, but calling it simply a police action. Now, his approval rankings went down, especially when he tries to seize the steel plant in Youngstown. The Supreme Court stopped him, because taking private property, even during a time of war, undeclared though it may be, was going over the line for the Supreme Court. But continued hysteria over the Red Scare allowed Eisenhower to expand executive authority involving surveillance, espionage, and intelligence. And that's really what I want to focus on today. The newly created CIA and the launch of Sputnik in 1957 gave the president great power to try to close the missile gap and catch up to the Russians. Back in the 19th century, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee really held most of the power regarding our foreign policy. But by the 1960s, the president was undisputed architect of our foreign policy and national security policy. President Kennedy dramatically increased executive control through his Ex-Com Committee, which was the executive committee of the National Security Council. That was the group that met during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was not a single member of the judicial branch or the congressional branch on that committee. Decisions rested exclusively on Kennedy and his inner circle. Lyndon Johnson continued this. He was more familiar with Congress, but nevertheless, although he got congressional support for intervention in Southeast Asia through the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in '64, after that he was off and running. Unrestrained bombing of North Vietnam, increasing our troops by 100,000 without any congressional approval. Nixon scaled back our Vietnam due to political purposes, but he opened relations with China. 800 million people suddenly had formal relations with the United States. His hubris was the domestic politics. He thought he could do whatever he wanted. The tapes certainly reveal that. And he went to the court to stop publication of the Pentagon Papers. Those were the papers that detailed our various illegal and unconstitutional interventions into Cambodia and secret bombings and so on. And he said it threatened national security. This is an argument that we hear all the time now. At that point in time, thankfully the Supreme Court, said that it had to be published. Transparency was the victor there. But after Watergate, President Ford pardoned Nixon for all crimes, and then reasserted executive authority over foreign policy. He declared that the War Powers Act did not significantly restrict presidential power at all. 5 years later, Jimmy Carter sent a secret mission into Iran to rescue hostages. Reagan ignored the war power limits when he had deployed 1,200 Marines into Lebanon and invaded the tiny island of Grenada, supposedly to save U.S. citizens. George Herbert Walker Bush upped the ante in 1989 when he sent 12,000 troops to Panama to arrest Governor Manuel Noriega for drug trafficking. And then, of course, was the first Gulf War. These are just some of the examples of what the president has been able to do in this century regarding violent and expansionist foreign policy. And that increased many times after the 9/11 attack. Now, the very real threat of terrorist cells, accentuated by the ghastly and omnipresent television repeating of the crash into the Twin Towers, increased executive power even more. President Bush got Congress to support substantial military intervention in Afghanistan and in Iraq without a declaration of war again. As a culture, we switched to a permanent war mentality, both overseas and domestically. In Unchecked and Unbalanced, the authors describe Bush's W's monarchist claims of executive powers as unprecedented on this side of the North Atlantic. They voiced concern over the executive unilateralism that not only undermines the delicate balance of our Constitution, but also lessens human liberties and hurts vital counterterrorism efforts by bringing into question our global moral authority. Defended with very questionable legal reasoning by Assistant Attorney General John Yoo, you may remember this. John Yoo said that Bush had to be able to take, quote, whatever actions he deemed appropriate. The president insisted that the military decisions included, quote, the method, the timing, and the nature of the response, and those are for the president alone to make. Bush secretly authorized National Security Agency to eavesdrop on telephone calls and emails, maybe yours and mine, without court orders, and he resisted Congress's authority to limit coercive interrogation tactics. He detained people indefinitely and denied them legal rights, and when members of Congress were briefed on this, they were told they could not even tell members on the intelligence community. In the Intelligence Committee of the Senate and the House could not be told what they were told from the administration. That guts oversight. Now, the present Democratic administration has normalized what has been going on, this executive expansion of power, and it fundamentally challenges, I believe, the integrity of our nation. It's not so surprising, by the way, that Democrats are doing this, because over history, the Democrats have been the most aggressive regarding the military because they're so afraid they're going to be called on as weak. The Republicans somehow have a sort of naturally protected shell of, oh yeah, they're the tough ones. So the Democrats tend to enter most of the wars, and I think strut their stuff militarily more than they need to. Today, from surveillance to intelligence, from detention to interrogation, to targeted killings and to drone strikes, we're involved in ethically questionable and perhaps condemnable behavior. And that's made only possible because of our tax dollars and our acquiescence. I feel responsible, so I feel like I have to talk out. The two general trends I find most worrisome are simply the unilateral nature of the decisions, that they're being made by a very small group of people, and the total lack of transparency. Those two pieces. Now, Congress has given, historically and constitutionally, lots of latitude to the president to do various things involving national security. But there's always been some oversight. A recent New York Times editorial entitled "To Kill an American," which was about the death of Anwar al-Awlaki, an American who lived in Yemen, reveals that the administration argued that the only oversight necessary came from within the executive branch. Well, if you exclude the courts and Congress and the public, that's hardly oversight. Add to this ever-increasing secretiveness, and you have a recipe for abuse. Now, John Dean, of Watergate fame, just spoke a couple years ago at the New York Society for Ethical Culture, and he pointed out that the Obama administration started out trying to be more transparent than his predecessor by releasing early memos of torture and the photographs of Abu Ghraib. I don't know if you remember that. It was really a breath of fresh air. But Dean pointed out that there's a tendency for all presidents that they last for a little while. He says it takes 100 days for the national security community to lean on the president so hard that eventually the president defers to them and only speaks with the national security community within the CIA, the military, and Homeland Security. And so, predictably, according to this Times article, after a couple of months, Obama ceased to sort of be transparent about our national security policy. So as a result, I find it hard to see a big difference between the national security program of the Bush and the Obama administration. Since Obama took office, warrantless wiretapping has increased, and some key provisions of the Patriot Act, as Jeff mentioned, has been extended through 2015. Big brother euphemisms are growing. There's something they're called the disposition matrix. This is a secret database compiled by the National Counterterrorism Center without judicial review or warrant, and it contains the strategy for disposing of various suspects without accountability or transparency. The United States continues to detain, interrogate, and kill suspects, and in doing so we violate some pretty substantial principles of justice. As put in the Magna Carta and encoded in our Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, we declare that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. I agree. Do you agree? Does the country agree? The Bush administration worked hard to eliminate any congressional oversight of interrogation tactics. You remember that? Claiming that they had the right to ignore the legal constraints on torture. Amazingly, in 2002, President Bush declared that, quote, none of the provisions of Geneva apply to our conflict with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan or elsewhere throughout the world. And this gave a green light to the sort of abuse that you saw at Abu Ghraib prison. A real stain on our history. Now, admittedly, the Obama administration and many in the Bush White House began to back off denial of Congress's role to limit interrogation tactics close to torture. But unlimited detention still continues as routine. And given the fact that many of the detainees down in Guantanamo are now dying in prison from natural causes, that's the equivalent of life in prison without parole. And without due process for those people, that comes pretty darn close to torture in my mind. Creeping executive authority has also justified preemptive and preventative strikes. Recently, this is the weirdest thing, the Pentagon has suggested that imminent threat does not mean the threat is imminent. This is the reasoning that they are pushing now, today. It argues that the term imminent threat does not have to imply concrete, specific, or impending danger. So by maintaining the term imminent threat, which in the international community justifies intervention and preventive attacks, but by redefining it, the executive authority is allowing themselves permanent warfighting capacities. That's approved of by the international community. This is the kind of 1984 redefinition of language that is particularly dangerous. A Pentagon white paper arguing that Mr. Obama has the right to kill any American citizen that, quote, informed high-level official decides is a senior operational leader of Al-Qaeda or an associated force and presents an imminent threat of violent attack. If imminent meant what it used to, I might feel better about that directive, but it doesn't. Some Americans accept this due to apathy or ignorance, or because they're simply afraid or belligerent. And our leaders tend to whip up a bloodlust in our population to push us to approve of these excessive measures. Like when President Obama said over and over and over again, we will find and kill Osama bin Laden. That saddened me. Why couldn't he have said, we will find and bring Osama bin Laden to justice? Had he been killed in the attack, that would have been another thing. But at least try to live up to some of the principles of justice. It certainly would have honored our integrity better, I believe. But it's easier simply to kill people than to detain them. Because once you get into jail, it's very inconvenient. So that brings me back to this notorious kill list that you've been hearing about. As the U.S. shifts from conventional war to counterterrorism, this kill list is going to grow and probably become a permanent part of our national policy. John Brennan, who's been nominated to head the CIA, was instrumental in kill list policy. The Washington Post reported that Brennan's helping the administration make routine the highly classified practice of targeted killing, transferring ad hoc elements into a counterterrorism infrastructure capable of sustaining a seamless, endless war. So the administration is defending the killing of American citizens that they think are a part of Al-Qaeda, rejecting oversight in advance or review after the fact. Information about the killing of Al-Qaeda and his son is not forthcoming. The ACLU and the New York Times have demanded the release of the operational memo describing that attack. I demand it too. We have to have some sense of an ability to see what our government is doing with our money in our name. Now, such accountability is going to become more and more important as our technology increases. We have the ability through special ops forces and drones now to kill like we've never done before, and we are just beginning our technological innovation here. One administration official said, waving his hands like this, said, "It's really like swatting flies. We can do it forever easily and we feel nothing. How often do you really think about killing a fly?" That's scary language when you're talking about killing human beings. Drone technology prior to 9/11 was only for surveillance. Since 9/11, and there are very few countries that have these drone technologies, but since 9/11, 70 countries have them. 3 of them have armed their drones: US, Britain, and Israel. They can be used without putting American troops in danger, which makes them politically very attractive. And many Americans support their use, and maybe there are times where they're very useful. But we can't forget that really it amounts to execution without trial anywhere in the world. The Obama administration is killing 6 times more people with drones than did the Bush White House. The technology has improved so that while 50% of those killed under the Bush White House were citizens, only 10% of those killed in the Obama White House, according to relatively sure sources, are citizens. And Obama has scaled back the use of drones, primarily in Pakistan, because the Pakistanis themselves are furious about it. But innocent people continue to die. In Yemen, since 2009, more than 400 people have been killed. 80 of them have been innocent citizens. Now, we aren't the only bad guys. One reason why we're doing that in Yemen is because Yemen has been terrorized by Al-Qaeda. Recently, Obama went off killing 100 innocent people in Yemen, an Al-Qaeda bomb. But in Yemen, with ghastly practice, drone technology has been improving, becoming more accurate and deadly. The training is improving. Legions of young gamers are signing up to be those who guide the predators and the reapers. We're training more young people today to guide drones than we are training young people today to be pilots. In a few years, 1/3 of all of our military aircraft will be unmanned vehicles. All shapes and sizes of drones are being developed, from things the size of footballs that will be able to go through, hovering through a window on the other side of the world to take photographs or to kill. That's power. And we had better get used to knowing how to control it. Do the people using the drones know the power? Do we know how much this is going to change the face of warfare? And it's not just going to be us using the drones, too. That's our money, your and I money, paying for this. The troops are safer. That's a good thing. They're behind a screen. But it's an eerie thing. They refer to successful target elimination with phrases like, "We got good bug splat on that one." Good splash is another term. The Navy logo that Bob Cave showed me is a picture. This is for the Unmanned Aviation Strikes Weapon Force, is a Grim Reaper with glowing red eyes. So it's not just technology, it's a frame of mind that I feel is growing. Combine this technology and this state of mind with this sense of permanent war and fear in our population, and the abuse of ethical principles and human beings becomes more likely. It places on our president ever greater moral responsibility. And as always, sadly, profits are involved. Right now there's a huge industry pushing this technology, and they're the ones with access to the people in power. And I think we have to recall General Eisenhower's phrasing that we should be wary of the military-industrial complex. Because combined with fear of terrorism and executive secretiveness, this is just going to continue to increase. History has taught us a lot about executive authority and how it grows, including the fact that executive authority is wielded by human beings like you and me, with human limitations. We're not perfect. That's why we need oversight and division of power. John Jay, over 200 years ago, in the Federalist Papers, wrote, "It's too true, however disgraceful it is for human nature, that nations in general will make war whenever they have the prospect of getting anything by it. Nay, absolute monarchs will often make war when their nations are to get nothing by it, but for the purposes and objects merely personal, such as thirst for military glory, revenge for personal affronts," Iraq too, "ambition, or private compacts to guise power or support their particular families or partisans. These and a variety of other motives which affect only the mind of the sovereign often lead him to engage in wars not sanctified by justice or the voice and interests of the people." 200 years after that was written, it's time that we demand more accountability from our president regarding surveillance, detention, interrogation, and targeted killings. We have to have transparency and accountability. Powerful presidents have to be asked ethical questions, and we must get the answers. Thank you very much.